the next Friday, I had another 0 to 4 a.m. watch, which isn't common really. It's like only if you get in trouble because Friday midnight to 4, nobody wants to do that. So I had another one, and there was the petty officer of the watch. He was a bit overweight, blonde guy, blonde mustache, and he was sitting behind the computer. And he pointed at the computer screen. He said, "What do you think about that?" And it would just look like a picture, like a black and white picture of like your stereotypical kind of gray. And he said, "What do you think about that?" And I said, "Did you get that off the internet?" And he said, "No, look." And when he said, "Look," next to that sliding glass window, there was this very big window. That sliding glass door, there was a big window stopped about 6 inches from the ceiling, six inches from the floor, and it was like an office room behind it. And when he pointed, I looked at it, and it was just right there. And then he said, "Do you mind if it comes in here?" And I said, "Does it mind if I look at it?" And I heard in my head, "No, I don't mind." But he said, "No, I don't mind as well." And it was actually kind of light brown, had like a hue of pink about it, big black eyes, small nose, like really no nose hardly, no ears. It had a fold of skin going from its tear ducts down to its cheekbones. And it walked out, and it had very long fingers. I remember right away. It kind of had to walk like with its hands in C shapes, or it would have drug its fingers on the ground. Long palms, long fingers, and it walked in almost very robotic. And it had something that looked like a silver pistol in its hand, like polished metal. And I just got back from Iraq, and I started saying "gun," and it was coming right at me, coming right towards me. And I stood up and I pointed and I said "gun," and they all said it's not a gun. And it kind of put its hand out to show me what it was. And I noticed it was the same guy that was behind the stainless steel table when I first walked in the underground base. And he was behind it, and he had his rifle on his shoulder, and then he had it at the ready, which means he had it like in his hands. It wasn't pointed at me, but he had it in his hand. And so I sat back down, and it was still walking towards me, and there was this small little Dell computer on the ground, and it was actually a drill. It wasn't a pistol, and I took apart this small little Dell computer very quickly, like a machine. It didn't have to guide the bit in or anything like that. It just hit the screws every time, and it was catching with the other hand. So it was catching all the screws as it was taking this computer apart. Slid the top off, popped out 2 gigs of RAM, put it on top of the table. It was short. I had to reach up, grab two more, put them in, slid it back down, and it kind of had to it flicked its hand forward, and every time it was able to set a screw in between its fingers when it flicked it forward, and it was able to put it together almost as quickly. And then it just stood there in front of me, and it looked this way. I kind of turned around to look at it, and it moved its head for me, and I was able to see both sides of it. It moved its hands back and forth for me. And after a while, I just got kind of bored with it. It was just standing there, and I was looking at it, and it just turned around and walked back into the underground base. And the petty officer of the watch said, "Do you think you could work around something like that?" And I said, "I don't know why not." I think it was a test to see, like, gauge what I would do, if I would run away or attack it or what. And he started saying things like, "You're smart." And I said, "Really?" He goes, "Yeah." I said, "How smart?" I said, 140, 150 IQ. He said, "More like 190, 195. And then he started telling me things like, "You smoke," because I smoked at the time. And he says, "But you don't have any clots. That's because you drink," because I drank at the time. And I said, "How do you know all this?" And he said, "You see that scanner you walk through?" And he's talking about that metal detector, what I thought it was a metal detector. They called it a scanner. He says that, it scans everything. It finds out your IQ, if you have any clots. It gives you like a complete physical every time you walk through. And these guys who worked in the underground base had to walk through it, every day. And he asked me why I was a CB, and I said, "Well, I had a marijuana paraphernalia charge when I was 19, so all I could do was construction or be a cook." And he said, "Oh, don't worry, that's not going to affect you here." And he asked me if I had any hobbies. He said, "With your scores, you'll be an officer." He said, "You have plenty of time if you have a hobby." I said, "I used to play classical guitar." And he said, "Oh, they'll really like that." And I said, "Who's they?" And he said, "Well, there's Germans up there." And I said, "Up where?" And he goes, "In the moon and beyond." He really didn't call it space. He just said, "Up there." And I mean, he was just telling me just different things. I asked like what they were, and he said we don't know. He said all we know is they've been here as long as we have, and there was some kind of war we got into where we had outside help, but we participated in the war, and I guess one of the deals or something like that. One of the part of the surrender when they lost was they had to go underground, and they've been infiltrating our uh, religion and our government and our schools ever since. They've been trying to like infiltrate us in different ways. And he really didn't seem to know a lot. He was like a lower level guy, I think, in the program. He said he went to the moon very often. He pretty much stayed on Earth, though. I mean, that was like his 20-year and back. And he said, he asked me if I knew the guy who won the PRT test every year. And it's a physical readiness test. Most push-ups, can run the fastest and everything. And he was a younger kid, around 18 or 19. And I said, yes, I know him. And he said, well, that's me. He said, I joined the program. And this guy was like 35. And he said, don't tell him. He said, that's why I have the mustache. It's like a disguise. And so on Monday, the executive officer came directly to the garage, which really doesn't happen. They usually will, come to you and they'll talk to you. I mean, you usually go to their office and they'll talk to you. But he came directly to the garage and asked for me. And I came out. First, we walked outside and we were just walking and small talk. How do you like England? Things like that. And he said, how does it feel? And I said, what? He's like, no, well, he asked me what I thought about, the drone that I saw. That's what they call them, drones, and pretty interesting. And he said, how does it feel to have a 195 IQ? And one of the guys earlier told me that whenever I saw the computer screen, when the first class petty officer of the watch showed it to me, it was like color coded lines that kind of went up and down a little bit. And so there was one right above me, and I was right below it, and there was a gap in the rest of the guys. So he said, petty officer of the watch told me that I was the second smartest person on base. One of the guys came up to me and said, you know who the smartest is? They asked me what I thought about, the long spindly finger, big black eyes, kind of creepy looking, asked me what I thought about that. And I remembered as it was happening, I was pinching myself on the thigh when I was witnessing this thing. And the petty officer of the watch said, do you think you're dreaming? And I said, no, I want to have a mark on my body in case you erase my memory so I'll remember this. And he said, no, you'll remember this for now. And I woke up in the morning, I remember I had a blood blister on my thigh. I gave myself a mark. And then I saw this other person who worked in the underground base immediately. And, what did you think? He said, he said, you know who the smartest person on base is? And I said, no. He said, it's EXO. He said, the executive officer is the smartest person. He has an over 200 IQ. And so I was, walking on the sidewalk on the base with him. And he said, how does it feel to have a 195 IQ? And I said, well, you would know, sir. I said, you're only person on the base smarter than me. And he said, oh, so you know, huh? And I said, yes. And he said, well, who told you? And I didn't want to say at first, but he just kept on saying, who told you? And I eventually told him, and I said, but everybody knows, everybody was coming up to me asking me, why are you a CB? Things like that. And then he asked me why I was a CB, and I told him I had a marijuana paraphernalia charge when I was 19. And that's all I could do was instruction to be a cook. And he said, well, that won't affect you here. And he told me about, he said if I ever heard of Gary McKinnon. And this was like a current event at the time, and it was in Scotland. And he told me he hacked into NASA, the U.S. Army, and the U.S. Navy. And he found files called Project Solar Warden, where he found things like extraterrestrial officers with ranks and social security numbers, pictures of cigar-shaped craft over the moon, and he said it's all true. And he said the only reason they didn't extradite him is because if they did, he would have been able to call witnesses if he went to court and would have blew the lid off Solar Warden. And it was during the Iraq War, so it was pretty easy to cover up. And he said, we have a program called the 20-year and back. He said, we put you in the program, you do 20 years, we send you back in time 20 years, age regress you 20 years, wipe your memory, and you wake up in bed like nothing happened. And I said to him, I can believe in wiping one's memory, and I can believe in going back in time, but there was something about age regression I found hard to believe. And he said, after what you just saw, you find that hard to believe. And I said, well, touche, sir, but yes. And he said, well, it's true. Like he wasn't convinced. He wasn't going to bother trying to convince me any further. And he said, with your scores, I guarantee you'll make commander and pilot of a 4-kilometer-long starship. And he told me they look similar to the ships in Battlestar Galactica. And I thought about it as I was walking with him, and I said that scanner I walked through, going in an underground base, it could tell if I had clots in my body or, anything. And he said, yes. And I said, well, my dad died of a widowmaker, a heart attack when I was 19. And he had a clot in his heart that we didn't know about, and it just broke off and he died. And I said, if we would have had technology like that, it would have saved his life. I said, why isn't this technology, available to the public? And he went on about population control and everything else like that. And I said, well, there has to be a side that wants to release this to the public. And he said, well, there is. And I said, well, if you can get me on that side, I'll do it. And shook his hand, saluted him, and he said, one more thing, Mr. James. And he was calling me Mr. this whole time as well, which only officers call each other Mr. in the Navy. He said, one more thing, Mr. James. You're going to be escorted by a reptile, and he's big. And I really didn't know what he was talking about, because I had no idea about any of these things.